So I'm sure you've all managed to orient yourself, but there are 4 different categories. So we have mobility, public realm, sustainability, and building and housing. I also want to reiterate what Nicole had mentioned. We have the note to reader. There are copies at every table. Please do take a look. It is also on the Waterfront Toronto website. Really great way to get yourself oriented. How this is going to look is Pina and Aaron will do about a 10 to 15 minute presentation to give you a bit more of a deep dive into the conversations. Then we will break out for about 40 to 45 minutes to have discussions. The facilitators are there to take notes and to report back. And the Waterfront Toronto staff are there to field any questions. Obviously noting, as Nicole had also said, that we have only had this MIDP for about 3 weeks and that they may not be able to answer every question, but it's important to have those raised because that means that we have to take a deeper dive into those categories, or if it is not in the MIDP, that needs to be flagged for further review. I don't want to take too much more time, so I think I will just pass it over to Aaron and Pina to get started. All right, thank you.
Great, thanks Alex. Hi, I'm Pina Malazzi, and I'm the Vice President for Design at Waterfront Toronto, and together with Aaron, we're going to walk you through I forgot to change the slide. Great. Oh, okay, there we go. And we're going to walk you through mobility, sustainability, buildings, housing, and public realm. As Christina mentioned, the MIDP is broken into a series of volumes. So the second volume, volume 2, includes all of the different innovations being proposed by Sidewalk Labs. In volume 2, there are a series of chapters, sub-chapters, and each of those chapters closely connects to the green list you see up here. So we're going to walk through each of these chapters one by one. What the chapters propose is a series of innovations to help us solve some of the urban challenges that cities are facing today. And the way that our presentation is laid out is that what we'll first do, area by area, is outline what Waterfront Toronto asks for, and then followed by what the MIDP includes as innovations in response to that. Starting with mobility. So what Waterfront Toronto asked for in the RFP was convenient and efficient transportation options for Quayside that could enable low carbon and affordable mobility solutions. And secondly, innovative funding strategies that could leverage public and private funding to secure an implementable model for light rail transit across the eastern waterfront. By way of context, for those who haven't been engaged deeply in waterfront consultations in the past, there is an approved transit plan to bring better transit than what you probably experience today down to buildings like this one and beyond in the eastern waterfront. And at the mobility table, we'll talk a little bit about that. So some of Sidewalk Labs' innovative ideas. So first of all, their proposal is based on reducing the need to own a car by providing safe, connected, and affordable options for every trip. So this graph on the right shows what they predict using modeling mode share would be like in the community that if all of the innovations are implemented. To help everybody orient themselves, the gray bars that you see there, the first one being transit, is what would happen in 2041 if we proceeded with all the plans that the city has in the docket to have in place. The orange bar to the right of that is Sidewalk Labs' proposed mode share if we implemented all the innovations in the MIDP. And if you keep going across the bar, because it's a bit difficult to read, I'll just quickly tell you what each of the series of bars represents. The next one is walking and biking. The one after that is hail rise. The one after that is other, for example, carpool, school buses, etc. And then the last one is actually private automobile. So you can see that where some are increasing, the one that really decreases is the private automobile. So their proposals based on reducing the need for a private automobile. The next couple bullets talk a little bit about streets. So in the MIDP, they've proposed 4 different street typologies to be used in varying different ways in Quayside and even beyond Quayside. Those streets are designed to be people first and include a prioritization of sustainable modes like cycling and pedestrians, etc. They've also, within those streets, include curbless, adaptable edges. So they're curbless streets, so you wouldn't have a curb that delineates car space from other space, and the edges would be dynamic so that, for example, if you're in the AM, PM peak, and there's a lot of pickup and drop off at a building like this where students are coming, at 9 o'clock to get to class, you'd use that curb for that pickup and drop off function. But then at lunchtime, when everybody's coming out of class and wants to eat lunch, you could take that curb space back and use it for outdoor cafes. Just want to make sure I catch everything. So the next one is around pricing. So again, using the curb example, they would use different levers to encourage good behavior. If we notice that lunchtime, there's actually a ton of drop-off and pickup happening, but we really want that space for, moving folks on cycling, or for moving cyclists, and or for cafes, you may increase the price of using the curb at that time of day to help encourage that use. And another one of the innovations is around integrating the different travel modes. Today, you have your Presto card to get on Presto. You might have a bike share membership or an Uber app that gets you an Uber. What they're proposing is to design an optional app-based mobility pass where you would get a specific number of trips for each of those modes on a monthly basis that you could use as you see fit, with an emphasis on sustainable modes. So you may only get one car share included in that mobility pass, so you can go to your groceries one weekend a month or the cottage one weekend a month, but you might get, unlimited transit, unlimited cycling, etc. A couple more. So from a freight perspective, Sidewalk Labs proposes to reduce the number of trucks on internal streets within the precinct by having a urban consolidation center, which would be at the P1 level of one or two of the sites within the precinct. The urban consolidation center would have one aperture to get into it, so trucks coming to pick up garbage, to drop off whatever indigo orders that come to my house a lot, various other things would come in through one entrance, drop off goods, and then there would be a series of underground tunnels and delivery robots that would bring those goods to an individual location within the precinct. They're proposing to innovate around pavement using, you can see in the drawing there, a kind of unique shape of paver, what they call removable urban paver, and to integrate within those pavers different technologies, such as LED lighting to help identify the dynamic spaces. You can see in that drawing there where that dynamic curb might occur. Heating for things like the bike path, so we can have a longer season for cycling, and permeability, so that we can absorb stormwater within the streets as it's falling, as opposed to funneling it into underground systems. They also propose a new public sector entity under the public administrator called the Waterfront Transportation Management Association. We'll call it at our table the WTMA because that's a mouthful. And the WTMA would collect revenue from selling the monthly mobility passes, for example. They'd manage what is a non-for-profit budget, and they'd set the fees for the curb or parking or various other uses. And they'd also be responsible for things like the removable urban pavement. And then lastly, and I think we heard this already today, but I'll just repeat it, Sidewalk Labs proposed that they're not willing to move forward with the development at Quayside without a commitment for funding of the proposed transit plan, the approved LRT plan, and have suggested an optional method for financing that. I'm gonna, sorry. Okay, so now public realm. So what we asked for in public realm was new methods and strategies for enhancing the public realm and potential benefits that technology could bring to augment public spaces and improve the quality of life in the community. I'll start with this image and quickly explain a large portion of the proposed public realm plan. I'm going to try and point. Let's see if this will, yeah, it's working. So we're standing in this rendering at Lakeshore and, well, we're really flying actually, at Lakeshore and Parliament Street, looking south. So there is currently a water body that comes north and Parliament spins around that triangular water body. So they're proposing to fill that in and create Parliament Plaza right at the arrival point at Lakeshore and Parliament with an integrated bicycle path. You can see off the bottom of the page. I'm not going to use this because I don't know, I can't even find it. And then midway through the rendering is Queen's Quay. So they're proposing that Queen's Quay would be integrated into Parliament Plaza and that there would be a slow order for LRTs as they move through so that pedestrian movement could easily cross the LRT and get to the south side where they propose Parliament Cove, which is a stepped boardwalk type space that provides access to a very animated Parliament slip. And then to the east or left, my left, is Silo Park. That's in the current approved plans for the precinct as the parkland dedication. So they would propose an adaptable public space at Silo Park. More green than what you're seeing in the foreground here, which is more hardscape. So the proposal, some of the innovations. So as I said, they propose a system of open spaces that are coupled with digital tools to help people experience the space. One example is enabling people to reserve the public areas. And I talk about my example of, I go to the park a lot at night with my 2 little kids and meet a lot of moms with little kids. You know, we don't always know if that really good picnic table next to the playground is going to be available. This particular piece of infrastructure could help you reserve your favorite picnic table at the park so everybody knows to meet at that picnic table. They also propose something called STOA, which is a flexible space on the interior of the building at the ground floor and the second floor, which would enable more of a pop-up like retail environment where you could lease a space for maybe a shorter period of time to enable someone maybe who's tinkering with starting a soap business, for example, to have an opportunity to give it a try, but also some fixed retail components within it. They also propose a mapping system, which would enable something really difficult to do today is we can build infrastructure underground. It's really hard to track that it's there 5 years later, unless that same person who worked on the project, you know, kind of remembers that there was a conduit put in place to allow for events to happen at that particular location, for example, on Queen's Quay. So they propose to create a 3D tool that would help identify where infrastructure is underground and help with the ongoing operations and maintenance of that infrastructure. So I think the next two I've already talked about because there's a lot of overlap between public realm and mobility. And then lastly, they propose an outdoor comfort system that's used to increase the amount of time you could be outside. This is a system that's attached to buildings, and if you've been at 307 Queen's Quay, which is Sidewalk's office, you'll see one being piloted on that building. In the blue box, I just want to point you to a governance model that's suggested for the public space, which is called the Open Space Alliance. So they're proposing a nonprofit organization that would be responsible for the ongoing operations and maintenance of the public realm here, which is at an enhanced level to maybe what would be delivered in other places in the city. So the OSA would both use funding that would have otherwise been used by the City of Toronto to maintain these spaces, but augment that through maintenance fees from the users of the ground floor, potential sponsorship revenues, and concessions from using the space for events in order to take care of those spaces. So with that, I'm going to give it to Aaron, who will walk you through a couple more.
Great, thanks Pina, and thank you all for your diligent attention early on Saturday morning. I'm going to cover 3 more topics that are within buildings and housing and then sustainability, and then we'll hand it to you all to kind of join the conversation. Within buildings and housing, it's worth noting that this is one chapter within volume 2 of the proposed mid-up from Sidewalk Labs, so I'm going to address these items together. Waterfront Toronto asks for innovative building technology systems, materials, and design approaches that could set the global standard for low energy design. And we'll talk more about that within sustainability in a moment. As well, we sought a neighborhood design that could respond to future and current trends, including the adaptive, inclusive places that respond to changing needs, while also exhibiting a sustainable built environment that exhibits design excellence. This is consistent with our approach here in the waterfront to date. With respect to affordable housing, we asked for the partner to exceed the Waterfront Toronto requirements, which is, as many of you may know, to set aside sufficient land to accommodate 20% of residential units as affordable housing in perpetuity. And we also asked for a viable, replicable, and implementable model, as well as a financing strategy to accommodate mixed income housing that was minimally required on government funding. Moving into what has been proposed by Sidewalk Labs, you have likely heard of the proposal for mass timber construction. Here on the screen we have the proposed elements for a 10, 20, and 30-story structure, which includes cross-laminated timber and glulam post and beam. It's worth noting here that these exceed the current Ontario Building Code. However, we are seeing a number of tall wood buildings here on the waterfront, including the new George Brown building, the Arbor, right next door to where we are now. In addition to the mass timber construction, which would be across the whole neighborhood in the proposal from Sidewalk Labs, they've outlined a number of strategies that can enable the community to be more flexible over time, including loft spaces that can adapt and expand or contract spaces, similar to what we've seen within loft spaces in Toronto, in King Street West, for example. As well, there are a number of technologies that can enable those buildings to be more flexible over time, including a proposal for DC power, mist-based sprinkler systems, as well as real-time performance monitoring. It's worth noting that those proposed systems, DC power and mist-based sprinklers, basically don't require the same level of sophistication to move those. It's kind of just unplugging like a USB as opposed to rewiring a building. On affordable housing, you can see here Sidewalk has proposed 40% below market housing for Quayside, with a number of nuances within that I'll describe now. They propose, down at the bottom you can see there's an element of what we refer to as capital A affordable rental, which is 100% of or less than average market rent, or AMR, as well as mid-range housing, which is between 100 and 150% of AMR, as well as shared equity housing, which is a new model that can allow a resident to own a percentage and pay the rent on the balance of the unit. As well, you can see here a breakdown of the rental and the ownership, which gets into a little bit more detail there. It's also worth noting, and there's another room that focuses on the development plan exclusively, but there's proposed to be more commercial, less density, and therefore less residential on the Quayside site than what is currently permitted on the site. Some elements of the proposal, in addition to this, Sidewalk has indicated that they would be willing to make an investment in a mass timber factory that could enable this mass timber construction here in Ontario. They've also indicated contribution to support the below market housing program at Quayside, and that would be implemented alongside a new public-private financing entity referred to here as the Waterfront Housing Trust. Within that Waterfront Housing Trust that's proposed by Sidewalk Labs, there would be a number of elements of funding that would support affordable housing, including a 1% market condo resale fee or flip fee, with the funds going into that trust. As well, they've proposed smaller and more affordable, more efficient units, which would allow for more units to be developed within the same footprint. There's more on that within the buildings chapter of the MIDP, as with all of these topics, and I would certainly encourage you to review some of those mock-ups and sketches. And lastly, Sidewalk has proposed, as well as their mass timber supply chain, a digital management system that could accelerate the pace of construction and potentially add value to land. And if you'd like to get into that in more detail, you can come right up here to my left in a few moments. Changing gears to talk about sustainability for a moment. Christina mentioned our ambitious goals around sustainability in the plenary session. So I'll just reiterate that with this project, Waterfront Toronto sought a new model for urban development that could include market transformation towards climate positive city building. A quick note on what climate positive refers to is to get into net negative carbon on an operational basis for a neighborhood. So basically, through the construction of this, there would actually be less carbon. And that's an incredibly ambitious goal that is only taking place in a handful of cities around the world. And within that, Waterfront Toronto sought pragmatic solutions to reducing greenhouse gas emissions within a new neighborhood. I'll walk through a few of the proposals that Sidewalk Labs has indicated in the MIDP, including first the use of highly insulated and airtight buildings inspired by the Passive House standard that some of you may be familiar with, supplied with renewable energy, including both the electrical and the thermal energy. Sidewalk has also outlined a series of tools that will enable the active monitoring and management of energy consumption within buildings, including a set of automatic schedulers that can control appliances, blinds, lighting, and other systems within the building. And it's worth noting within that there is a degree of data that would be needed to enable that kind of automation, which we can get into more detail at our table. Secondly, as Pina described, the transportation system is intended to move residents and visitors away from using personal automobiles and towards active mobility, public transit, and other low-carbon options. And if you want to talk about that more, that's probably covered in more detail in the mobility section. Sidewalk has also outlined some strategies that can better manage stormwater within the development sites before it enters the municipal sewers. And that includes active management with digital tools. So doing things like managing the salinity and the volume of water going into the sewers and measuring that, and doing things like pre-emptying cisterns in advance of a storm. They've also outlined a detailed proposal around a vacuum waste system that can decrease the solid waste that's being sent to landfill. And that vacuum waste system, of which there are several around the world, including notably a few in Sweden, that could also be coupled with digital tools that would enable better recycling and better sorting within units. And lastly, Sidewalk has indicated that in order to offset the natural gas consumption, get away from fossil fuels, that there could be an opportunity to capture sewer heat from the wastewater treatment plant at Ashbridges Bay, as well as the opportunity to export some of that clean waste heat to nearby neighborhoods on the waterfront. As kind of an overview of these carbon reduction measures, you see on the left here the 6.3 tons per capita, which is the current carbon footprint of Toronto on average, and then a series of initiatives that I've outlined that could bring Quayside down to 0.72 tons per capita, which reflects an 85% reduction. Further, Sidewalk Labs, as I mentioned, has indicated that through exporting waste heat, you could actually offset carbon in adjacent neighborhoods, thus qualifying a neighborhood like or here on the waterfront to be net negative from a greenhouse gas perspective. On the right, you see an example of a tool that's proposed by Sidewalk Labs for managing energy consumption within the home scheduler. And here you see some automation opportunities within a home, as well as a budgeting tool that can allow you to meet a specific energy budget on a monthly basis. There are much more detail and mock-ups on some of these proposed tools and apps for managing energy in the master plan. Lastly, in closing, there's a few points to highlight. In aggregate, Sidewalk Labs has indicated that these strategies could reduce greenhouse gases emissions by 85%, as I mentioned, and if expanded across a broader geography, could have a further 4% impact on the reductions. Sidewalk Labs has also proposed the creation of a new public sector management entity that would be called the Waterfront Sustainability Association. And this organization would be responsible for holding service contracts with the advanced system operators of the sustainability-related infrastructure system, such as the vacuum waste system that I described previously, as well as reporting on sustainability performance. And within that, Sidewalk has proposed that they lead the preliminary design of some of these systems that you see outlined in the master plan, and then there would be a competitive procurement to solicit the third-party operators. So that's a lot of information. Thank you for your attention. And I'm going to hand it back to our facilitator, Alex.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. And, is this on? Now is it on? There we go. All right. Thank you so much. Okay, so before we get started, I just wanted to highlight a few quick more things. I understand that there's a lot of information that is going around and that we are focusing kind of on one topic per table. Just want to reiterate that we know that all of these conversations are interconnected, and particularly to do with the digital governance. Even though it's in a separate room, obviously this is a conversation that will come up at each table, and we welcome it and we want to document it. The second part is, although I know you're all here for this very reason, we want you to share your perspectives honestly and openly, so please do tell us everything that you feel. We kind of have some guiding questions on the tables, on the little placards in the middle, which the facilitators will engage you with. Beyond your Q&A, which I fully expect will happen, we want to know, what of these innovations do you like or are you comfortable with? What are you not comfortable with? And kind of what conditions, if any, moving forward would you need in order to be kind of on board with this project or aspects of this project? So maybe just quickly by show of hands, is there anyone who isn't at the table that they want to be sitting with? Or is everyone more or less, except for this gentleman over here and he'll squeeze in? Okay, great. So we have approximately 50 minutes, which means 35 to 40 minutes for this session, and then we'll do a quick report back, and then we'll go back upstairs to the main room to meet with Nicole for the closing plenary, and everyone can begin. Thank you. So I'm going to ask the table facilitators to do a quick kind of 3 to 5 main key point report back to me. We're going to start with mobility and work our way around the room. Vicky has a mic, so she'll pass it over as we move along. If there's time for a question or two at the end of that, we'll do that, but otherwise please do hold any additional questions. There will be plenty of time at the plenary upstairs. And I also just want to say right now, another thing that Nicole mentioned, you've probably seen this kind of July 31st feedback deadline floating around. That is not the case. We can provide feedback with the online consultation through to the fall. We just kind of wanted a deadline to kind of inform the next round of consultation, so that's what the July 31st is for, but we will be receiving feedback for quite a while. So on that note, I'm going to pass it over to Vicky to kind of do her quick little report back to me.
First of all, there was a lot of interest in just understanding how this technologies around mobility works. There's a lot of interest in getting more information and questions around how specific aspects of the mobility plan will function. Second, certainly there is both interest and concern around the future of how we will dive into technology uses in our public spaces. So while there were questions around how the nature of our data will be used, there's also debate around the fact that this is already happening. And so as technology moves quicker than the pace that we might be able to catch up with the governance of it, there are questions around that. Certainly there are also questions about the relationships of those involved in delivering the mobility plan. So whether they are vendors, whether it's Sidewalk Labs, the governance of it was a question that was and the relationships of those involved were questions that we would like to explore further. And finally, certainly a debate around both the costs and the potential harms. So there's a nature around the extent to which this is generally good, and that brings us to a wider conversation about any kind of things that are happening on this site will certainly have implications not only for our city or globally, but for the region as well. So those are a few points. And is there anything key that I missed that people would like to raise? Okay, certainly a rich discussion that deserves to be continued. Thanks very much.
Thank you. All right, we're going to go over to sustainability now.
So with sustainability, we had a lot of questions at this table about just really what sustainability means. And I think this is really the broad theme, whereas are we talking about it in terms of in terms of technological and digital solutions? Because this discussion was really about, well, what is it about sustainable processes? Is it sustainable, financially sustainable? Like it's really, there's a lot of questions there as to what do we really mean by sustainable. We also just talked about just like natural systems and perhaps low-tech solutions that could be sustainable and could be appropriate and should be appropriate and maybe be applied to development here. Simple things like green roofs, which are probably going to be incorporated, but maybe we're glossed over and not included in this conversation. We also discussed how does this proposal and how do these innovations and how do these sustainable and green items support and help and expand to the greater area, and not just the lands that is in the discussion here, but how does it help the people across the street? How does it help the city? How does it help the community? And we also had a lot of questions on like how far we are just in the process. Like are certain technologies committed to? Is there a lot like where are we in this process and where are we in that? And I think there's a lot of clarity being sought there as well. Anything else? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, now we will go over to public realm.
Thank you. So our table, we talked a lot about the governance model and what that would look like. So there was some concern with even passing public spaces over to nonprofit organizations and how they really should stay within the city and the governance of that should stay within the city. So there was some discussion around what that looks like, and there's not enough detail on what's being proposed from Sidewalk Labs. So if we have public spaces, kind of maintaining that control and maintenance and operation within the city, or what happens if it's operated by a nonprofit organization. So like what's the give and take between those two options? And then we also, the table really talked a lot about, there's different ideas being proposed from Sidewalk Labs, but there's not a lot of information around what that looks like, who operates it, who maintains it, and so really just the need for more detail from Sidewalk and what how some of their ideas would actually operationalize or come into fruition. In general, though, the table did think that there was a lot of great ideas and a lot of great proposals for the public realm, and they were really interested in seeing it happen and kind of were excited to see what was being proposed, just wanting to know more information on the details of it all.
Thank you very much. Okay, and then our last table, which is building and housing.
Beautiful. So our table had a very expansive conversation and many questions were asked, some related a little bit outside of the scope of buildings and housing explicitly, but I want to highlight that there was a lot of deep conversation around accessibility and inclusivity and how that applies to both the physical spaces as well as how it's built, as well as the mix of folks in the area. So when we talk about inclusivity, there was a sense that the entire space needs to be accessible for people from infants to seniors, and how there was a lot of question around how we go beyond what the minimum is. So looking at the AODA standards, are the proposals going beyond those minimum standards? Questions around whether we could include transitional housing, group housing, housing for folks with special needs. And again, this kind of expanded also to what schools and daycares and seniors' homes might be in the space. And there was some comments around co-sharing efforts and how we can make the space more inclusive. Anything missed? Right, thank you, and thank you for that. In terms of safety, this kind of came into the stormwater physical spaces. Safety was a major element if the digital innovations failed. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left. We have time for maybe a couple kind of remaining comments or questions, if there are any, and then otherwise we do have the plenary. Is there anyone who has any kind of last minute thoughts? We have Michael over here.
Economically destructive and develop technologies that are going to be autonomous and inherently destructive as well.
Noted. Thank you, Michael. Is there anyone else? We have a gentleman over here who has a question.
Thank you. I'm concerned about the water level rising at Lake Ontario, and what are we going to do about it? It's a subject that needs in-depth study. We have to think in terms of raising the datum level, maybe gardener level, and then have an inverse level for the rest of the lands. So what we were thinking and designing, say, 5, 10 years ago, is passé. It's not going to work. So we need discussion on that.
Excellent, thank you. Do we have, we have one over here.
I'm a little bit, I'm wary of these very specific what do you call them? Like names of different entities that Sidewalk Lab is creating. I mean, I don't see the need for it. It makes it sound like there's a whole different realm of language being used. It's almost like, I mean, it just doesn't sound like a normal build. I don't know how to put it in words, but you
Maybe
know what I'm talking.
like explicitness. Are we looking for transparency maybe about what it actually means?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It just doesn't seem necessary. Why don't just say there's going to be a structure that can, I forget the name of it, but there was something there that was going to take care of all the, what was it, nonprofits, or it was something like that, and they gave it a special name, and then they had another. It's almost like, well, I don't want to use a word that's sort of provocative, but I think people get the idea that, you know, it just doesn't seem necessary. Why are they doing that? It sounds like they're imposing a whole different world. Yeah, well, it's that too. I mean, it's up to the. I thought they'd leave that up to the people to decide what they wanted, not just, you know, not put it all into specifics that much. When there's other things that need more specifics, that are more important, why are they putting such specific titles onto things?
Thank you. With that, it's time now, it's 11 o'clock, to head back upstairs. So we'll have an hour of plenary up there if you have more questions. And as I mentioned before, please do fill out the online feedback form as well if you'd like. Thank you.